Hello, everyone. I'm going to let you guys file in for a second. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 636th New Social Environment. I'm Raven, the Special Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Aruna D'Souza and Jason Rosenfeld. We're thrilled to welcome poet Chelsea Harlan here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of disposition and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Aruna D'Souza writes about modern contemporary art, intersectional feminisms, and other forms of politics, and how museums shape our views of each other and the world. Distinguished chair and professor of art history at Marymount Manhattan College, Jason Rosenfeld has curated numerous exhibitions internationally and is the co-author of the monograph Cicely Brown and the senior writer and editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail. And passing it over to you, Jason.
Thank you so much, Raven. Welcome, everyone, as you trickle into the Zoom today. Welcome, Aruna. Let me get some thanks out of the way. Well, GE is here, of course. Good to see you, GE. And I just want to note this is the 636th new social environment that we've done since March of 2020. And I always mention where we are on the Major League Baseball home run standings with 636. So we have passed the kid, Ken Griffey Jr., who had 630, and we are heading towards the Say Hey kid, Willie Mays, at number 6 with 660. We'll be there next month. I'm coming to you live from Watermill in the home of the Shinnecock Nation, who are having their annual powwow this weekend, finally, which was not happening during COVID. Aruna's joining us from the nation's capital, Washington, DC, where she is the William Wilson Corcoran Professor of Community Engagement at the Corcoran School of Arts and Design at the George Washington University, home of the Colonials. Fit all that on a card, good luck. She'll be there for a year working, but you'll see her more locally, reviews in the New York Times, of course, and elsewhere. Thank you to Chloe, who's running things these days at the Rail and NSE world. Raven, who's hosting with me today. Also, of course, Fong and Nick, if you show up today, who was stalwart in this whole process. This is my 28th new social environment, and it's been one of the great pleasures of my professional life to be doing this with you all at 1 o'clock here and there on a weekday. Also, shout out to my parents. It's their 58th anniversary. They had some kind of an appointment at 1 o'clock. It all sounds a little fishy, but hopefully they will be here later, and they'll obviously be watching on the recording. So we're going to talk today about Linda Nochlin, who was the Lila Atchison Wallace Professor of Modern Art during my time at the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University, home of the Violets, and Aruna's time there as well. She sort of dropped into my world when I was already midstream in my early PhD process, and changed my life in terms of shepherding me to the finish line in my learning. And Aruna will talk about her experience there as well. And she retired in 2013 from that position. So the celebration today is in honor of a new publication. Let me start the images. There's Linda. 2 pictures of her, one from the distant past and one from a little more recently, but a little double sort of shot there of her with the portrait, which we'll look at in a minute. She was on Instagram briefly, but pretty fun to look at what she was doing there. And here is the book, Making It Modern, Essays on the Art of the Now, published by Linda's longtime publisher, Thames and Hudson, and edited by Aruna. So Aruna, welcome.
Hi, Jason. Hello, everyone.
Great to have you here. And go ahead.
I was going to say, you're giving me like serious IFA throwback vibes with all the sports benchmarks. Jason was the one person that I knew of who could reliably know about sports. And so we had a professor of medieval art, Jason Alexander, at the Institute.
Jonathan Alexander,
and Professor Alexander had come from England and was desperate to learn about baseball. So he used to come and buy us tickets occasionally to a Mets game and just grab whoever was around. And as long as Jason was there, we would all go to the Mets game so Jason could explain to Jonathan Alexander how the statistics worked.
That is true.
One of my favorite memories of being at the IFA. Thank you.
I never had a class with him because I was too scared of him intellectually, and the period and all the languages. But I loved going to the baseball games with him.
I minored in.
We also had. Oh, you did? Yeah, you minored in medieval. Yeah. We also had recently passed away Jonathan Brown, who was a longtime Jets season ticket holder. There were some people interested in sports at the IFA, very few. And of course, during our tenure there, we had 2 intramural teams. We had a co-ed inner tube water volleyball team, and we had a co-ed inner tube water basketball team. And we made it to the semifinals of both tournaments downtown in the late lamented Cole's Gym. And we were beating sororities and fraternities. Meanwhile, Linda, of course, was a champion race walker, right?
Mm-hmm. She was
in her age group. She was super athletic. Yeah. You might see when we look at the video a little bit later. So yeah, it was good times at the IFA. I mean, I enjoyed myself there.
Yeah, I had a great experience too. It was a funny time to get there because, I applied to the IFA before it was known that Linda would be joining the faculty. Actually, she joined halfway through my first year, and I always and applications at the Institute went up within that year. I mean, threefold. I think within a year, because everyone wanted to come then and work with Linda. So I always say that, it was lucky that I squeezed in before Linda actually showed up, because I'm not sure I would have actually been able to be accepted at the IFA had I applied with much greater competition. But it was a really exciting time, because I think there were people like Linda, and like Jonathan Alexander and Rob Lubar and others who were sort of who were interested in a lot of new developments that were going on in art history, were at the forefront in Linda's case of a lot of those new developments, and who were, shaking things up a little bit in terms of introducing theoretical and new methodological approaches to art history. So in addition,
absolutely.
In addition to the baseball and the bowling, I think we went bowling once with the professor.
Bowling. We played softball in Central Park. We played against WNYC once. But I think also it was a great model for us as art historians, no matter what period we were working in, to see people who were both attuned, our professors, to their field and thinking about contemporary art. I mean, Linda, Robert Rosenblum, Jonathan Hay, so many people were working in the contemporary realm at the same time that they were, writing about their field, wherever it may have been historically or whatever part of the globe. And, it certainly was a model for me and what I'm doing now and have been doing thanks to the Rail since 2016, and sort of working in contemporary art, having come up as a Victorianist, British art historian with no one to teach me at a school that didn't really teach British art. Rosenblum gave a lecture once in a while on British art, but really when Linda showed up, she was a little, I always thought she was a little happy to have someone who was a bit of an oddball and wanted to work on the pre-Raphaelites like me, instead of, endless stream of people who wanted to work on things, right, that she had hoped, not to lump you in there, but just, the idea that because you did something radical and different with Cezanne, but the idea that, it was a break to work with someone, who's doing something different.
And I think Linda was really interesting because she was never interested in reproducing herself. In the grand tradition, I mean, academia, very traditional academia, the whole point is to, that professors come in and they reproduce themselves in their students, right? Their students end up carrying on their areas of expertise and things like that. And Linda really, obviously she made her mark writing about 19th century France and Courbet and Impressionism, post-Impressionism. And she had lots of students who wanted to come there and study those things with her. But the students who I think really in some ways got the most out of working with her were students who were really doing something very different with the material, either going out in completely new directions, things that she hadn't, like the pre-Raphaelites, or within their fields doing something that was, that was very different than what she did. And it was interesting having Linda as an advisor, because I felt like for me, she gave me just enough rope to hang myself, but enough that, enough that she could reel me back in if I was going too far afield. And that sort of independence and sort of, letting me be to go down my rabbit holes and things like that, I think was a fantastic training for what it would then be to sort of direct my own research program once I graduated and left the institute,
right.
And so, right. Yeah, I think that in a way, I mean, there was Tom McDonough, who's working on The Situationists. There were all sorts of people who were her students, really, who were working on fields that weren't directly related to what she was teaching, and she always really, I think, embraced that.
As you can see, anyone who picks up this book or her other publications, she was super adventurous. She really was, in terms of getting out there and looking at things. And another thing that she modeled, I think, for both of us, was the idea of being a critic and also being a curator, and that you can do all these kinds of things. And you nicely write about the idea of her being the possibility of being a public intellectual in the introduction to the book. And I think that was a critical thing. And then it was a thrill for us to have open the New York Times Magazine on July 17th, 1994. And there's a big two-page spread of her with Thierry Mugler, this, and talking about fashion and art and the now. And, that kind of thing was priceless, really. And it wasn't the airy, stuffy academia that you often sort of supposed it was going to be like. It wasn't like that at all.
No, and I think that it wasn't, in a sense, it wasn't just that she was both interested in contemporary and historical stuff. Like a lot of her interest in historical art history was very much driven by her her sense of where the world was at the moment, what she felt was urgent or interesting, or what was tickling her fancy in terms of what she was seeing, in the galleries, the artists that she loved, and vice versa. And so, she was a person who was both, she was interested in Courbet. She used to say, partly she wonders if she was so interested in Courbet because Courbet resembled her father. Do you remember her saying that in class?
Yeah.
Say it all the time. That Courbet looked like her father. So sometimes she wondered if that was the reason that she was so interested in Courbet. But her interest in realism, Courbet's and others' investigations into realism, led her as well to embrace something that really people weren't looking at so much at the time, or weren't looking at maybe as much as they could have or should have been, which was contemporary realism in the 60s and 70s. And then, there are other points in her papers, especially where, she's looking at, the sort of cultural conservatism of the 80s and this sort of the culture wars of the 80s, and it's causing her to go back and think about certain moments in historical, in 19th century art history, and how do we think about those things. So it was that was, I think, what was so amazing is it was a constant back and forth between her contemporary interest and her historical interests, that the two were sort of mutually reinforcing and driving each other. And I think within all of that too, that whether she was working on contemporary, whether she was working in art history, whether she was acting as a curator, the question of writing was always sort of foremost for her. Even though she kind of didn't spend a lot of time talking about it in our classes or anything like that, it was certainly something that she came from. Her first degree was in literature, right, in French literature.
Right.
She came from the point of view of being kind of immersed in writing, and I think that for me now, as someone who's sort of left the art historical field per se, and refashioned myself as a writer, I think that's been, in the end, probably her biggest influence on me, is just how seriously she took that as a kind of craft.
Right. And the thing that's amazing is, this book is wonderful on many levels. One is because there are many, many essays in here that no one's ever read, because they were delivered in conferences and she just never wrote them up.
Yeah.
And you can, in those, you can very much hear her voice very strongly because they were delivered orally, and they've been cleaned up a bit. But also, I always think about her writings, like those of Robert Rosenblum, who was one of my other mentors at the IFA, are marked by a kind of clarity and a sort of air of revelation. They ring with self-assurance and rightness, but they always are resplendent with her personality, and they never get mired in jargon and ever. And I'm not saying they're easy to read necessarily, but they are uncomplicatedly presented, I would say. And in a way, I have to say, with plug what we do at the Rail, it's part of the program. Fong can maybe speak to later, that idea of accessibility and intelligence, wrapped into one. And it marks her writing, and I hear her voice, all the time, whenever I'm looking at works or of course reading these essays.
Well, I think in terms of art teachers, yes, Robert Rosenblum was definitely a model for that. Also, Jonathan Brown was just a beautiful writer, in the sense that his writing was transparent. You almost couldn't, it was so beautifully styled that it kind of disappeared off the page into pure idea. Or Colin Eisler, who is also a fantastic writer, I think. So we have
retiring this month, I believe. It's
amazing.
Or next month he's retiring.
We had some amazing models in terms of that, but Linda was always, for me, it was precisely her voice, and it was her willingness to sort of jump in and kind of let and kind of show her enthusiasm, or her sense of humor, or her incredulity, or like her just like she was willing to kind of break that persona of the scholar, or even the public intellectual, and just be a kind of earthy, very real kind of presence, even in her writing. And I think that one of the other things that I think that really makes a difference when thinking about Linda's work is so many of her major essays were first published in places like Art in America. They weren't published in Art Bulletin necessarily. They weren't published in academic journals necessarily. They were published in sort of wider circulation art magazines. And I think that and her relationship with the editor, Betsy Baker, I think that made a huge difference in how she herself grew into developing her ideas and communicating her ideas. But I think really says a lot about the the purpose that she saw about her writing, that it was not about speaking to a sort of small group of experts, but rather of making ideas sort of part of the public conversation, or part of a larger conversation among like-minded people. And, you know, she had no problem, like, you know, demonstrating her own expertise, or her own, like, I mean, Linda was such a, you know, she had such a broad range of knowledge. She sort of had all sorts of references she could pull out of her hat, but it was always in the mind of making the story more interesting, not in terms of, like, you know, kind of gatekeeping in a certain way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a sort of advancement of the narrative in a way, and an avoidance of inscrutability. And I think, you know, it was wonderful that so many of those essays from Art in America are long format essays. We don't see that often anymore. I mean, they are long essays, as you see them reproduced here in the book. And, you know, they gave her the space to say what she needed to say. And then once in a while, she would just be inspired by something, like the essay about Bonar. Bonar's Bathers, which, I mean, I remember that, you know, I remember she really had her back up because she went to John Elderfield's show at MoMA, and she just thought, you know, what, he's missing the point, you know. And then I'm sure she went home and just said, I need to write this now, and someone's going to publish it. And I think she gave a talk about it, right? And then, you know, publish it.
You know, that seemed like so much of what so many of these essays are about, is, like, you know, Linda got to be
responsiveness.
Like their responsiveness. They were going around to shows, they were having conversations with friends. Like, I feel like so many of these essays on things on French art happened when she and someone like Abigail Solomon Godot, or, you know, one of her other dear friends who she'd meet up with in Paris in the summers, went to see something and had a conversation, and then decided that, you know, that she decided that she needed to write an essay. And in a way, I love seeing that motivation. You know, the biggest fear when I became an academic, I was like, how am I going to think about what I want to write, right? Like, how am I going to decide on the next project? And seeing that it could literally just come out of, you know, this moment of excitement when you're standing in front of something and looking at it and saying, like, it's saying to a friend, oh, this is strange, and then deciding, like, oh, okay, that can turn into my next project, my next essay. But you know, and then the other thing about Linda, I think, as a writer, that's so important, and to me, always exciting about her work is, like, Linda, and something that I definitely inherited from her. I'll say, like, this is something that you know, I've definitely followed in her footsteps in terms of my own career, is Linda was a person who was all about the essay. And didn't, I mean, you know, didn't write books. I mean, she, you know, of course she did, but that wasn't the primary mode of her production. Her mode of production was thinking in terms of the discrete essay. And you know, she always said it was because she wasn't interested in creating master narratives. She wasn't interested in, like, you know, in ever presenting anything as definitive, right? The way that a book might imply. That she was always flitting, in a sense, from one topic to another, as her interests moved and changed. And because she was working in contemporary and early 20th century and 19th century and 18th century, right, all of these periods, and then, you know, a sort of relatively broad geography, that the essay seemed to make most sense for her. And so, you know, and
it's also it's also a personal thing, I think. I mean, because I look at it too from my perspective, and perhaps yours. I mean, Linda, you all had children. There's no prospect of going for me to England for a 6-month period. Forget it. I wasn't interested in doing that and leaving my kids, you know, and plus my wife is the real breadwinner anyway. But you know, the thing that you know, that wasn't a possibility. You do that for your dissertation, maybe your first book, and then you have a family, and this is a reality. And the essay is a way to go, is a way to, you know, evolve your ideas in a more compact form and give it orally and work it out, and then write it down. I think that's, you know, that's very different from a long-term 6-year project. Right.
I think that's really true. And I also think that she was a person who was asking like these very surgically precise questions. I mean, you know, it's amazing when you think of how much Linda has transformed the field of art history via the essay, right? She didn't have to write. I mean, you know, there's all sorts of fantastic books that you can point to, right? You can point to Tim Clark's Painting of Modern Life. You can point to Rosalind Krauss's, you know, Originality of the Avant-Garde, another modernismist. You can, you know, there's all these books you can point to as books that have, you know, in a sense, changed the course of art history. But Linda changed the course of art history with The Imaginary Orient, right? An essay. Linda changed the course of art history with.
Well, why are there no great women artists?
Right? Like these are essays, and I think that the reason she was able to do that via the essay is that her questions were so surgically precise. I think of them like she was going to cut out the heart of the matter, like cut into the heart of the matter, and like, you know, and ask the question that, you know, that in a way seems so obvious to ask, but no one was asking it, right? Like, or the way seemed, you know, and I think that's, you know, she said once to me that she thought that every once in a while she'd sort of say that she wondered if, you know, that she thought that maybe people didn't value certain of her essays, you know, as much because she was saying something that sounded to them so obvious, right? And you know, but it wasn't obvious at the time that she said it. It's just that it was so true that the minute you hear it, it's like, oh yeah, this has always been the case, or this has always been known, or whatever. Like, how could we not have thought this way?
Like the Grand Jatte essay. I mean, the Grand Jatte essay is just which is from Museum Studies 1989. Seurat's Grand Jatte and an anti-utopian allegory. It just seems like you read it and you say, yes, actually, this is what it has always been. And you just put it into words in a clear way. With all the necessary footnotes and everything, you know,
But you know what? This is really funny because Linda didn't want to put that essay in the book originally. In this book, she was like, really, that one? And I was like, Linda, that to me, that's one of her great, like, I mean, again, like you know, changed absolutely the way that we think about Seurat, and the way that, you know, and the way that we think about you know, even ideas of labor and
motherhood and fashion and even landscape, which I think she shied away from a little bit. We could talk about that. Let me go to one image. I'm going to read a little bit here, and we can talk about the way that she sort of addressed this. This is Philip Pearlstein's fabulous, of course, portrait of Linda and her second husband, Richard Palmer, from 1968. And here's what Linda wrote about it in art form. The year 1968, a quarter of a century ago, was an important one in every way. It was a year of political and cultural revolution, a year when canons were questioned, assumptions swept away, flatness, abstraction, formalism, patriarchy, racism, cultural authority of every kind. The doctrines of modernism were never accepted so unquestioningly again. The portrait, for me, was part of the end to the simple acceptance of what art was about and had to be. The next year, women's liberation made its dramatic entry with a whole new set of revolutionary rejections and innovative projects, including the women's movement in art. The portrait, then, simply by being painted when it was painted, became a kind of talisman of change and new beginnings, despite its apparent representation of stasis It is resonant with a certain mental energy, poignant with a congealed memory of lost hopes and achieved desires. That's the conclusion of this short little piece that she did, reflecting on this portrait that Philip, who I did a Zoom with a couple months ago in this format, that Philip made. And that's from September 1993. But I think that, get that little quote gets into everything that you talk about in the introduction, and that is evident in her writing, right? This idea of the moment that it's an understanding historical context, thinking about it as part of the past and a stream of in art history, and also having a brilliant eye for formal qualities and aesthetics. And she talks in the essay about the triple shadows beneath her little stool. But then she also talks about what a pain in the ass it was to pose for it. But this is like her in a nutshell, to take something like this, which was not a public work of art, but turn it into something that was reflective of the public in the period.
Well, this is Linda had this hanging in her living room. So anytime you would go to visit her, she would be sitting in her armchair under this like larger than life size representation of her. And there was something, the other part of it, and in the late 90s, Jason and I and a bunch of students at the IFA organized a Festschrift in honor of Linda. She had the idea of calling it Self in History, or we had the idea, I don't know, but she, based on a lecture that she had given. And I think that what's really beautiful about this quotation, right, is that it shows that for her, it's always that intersection, right, of self and history. And, so this is all of these things. As she says, part of the end to the simple acceptance of what art was about and had to be under the pressure of all these sort of political and social changes. But it was also her wedding portrait, right? It was done.
Yeah.
It was done. It's her and her husband, I think right before they were setting off to go to the American Academy in Rome, where Dick Palmer was a fellow in the following year, and it was painted a year before their daughter Daisy Palmer was born, and so this was really a wedding portrait as much as anything else. But for her, there's no, the way that she writes about art, the way that I think she thinks about art, there's no separating that personal story of from what it also was, right? That this was a moment, this was a charged moment, right? This was a moment where nothing in the past could continue as is, and the future was all about potential change, right? So what better way to talk about that moment of like entering into this vow with someone else and starting a new life together, at the same time as it's also about, the anti-racism and the women's movement and
right,
all of those other things. And so, I think it's so, deeply Linda in a way to, the way you thought about this. Yeah.
And G comments it straight out of a Bergman film, or that kind of alienation that you see in Antonioni's high modernist films in the same period. But of course, Pearlstein is a radical artist in 1968. Make no mistake about it, right? When everyone else is doing second-gen abstract expressionism, minimalism is ascendant, Judd's writing furiously, and pop art, is happening. And here is Pearlstein digging away, painting these magnificent realist style, but not really, they're quirky paintings. And I think she clearly responded to that. And then 5 years later, she sits for Alice Neal with Daisy, who you just mentioned, who was then around 4 years old.
Who I think is actually in the room. So hi, Daisy.
Hi, Daisy. Welcome. We saw the show, of course, at the show at the Met. Here's a photo of a couple of my students admiring it. I've seen it before, of course, but it's such a sharp focus portrait of a person who actually feels like she didn't really get along with Alice Neal from what I've read and the documentaries that I've seen. You know, they sort of didn't see eye to eye in terms of their approach
That
to
I
the
did
world.
not know. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think so, but someone else on the Zoom can confirm that. But it does get to that sort of, she does get her gaze and that ring, you know, and the ring is the thing that anyone who ever heard Linda talk knows. She loved these large rings and jewelry, and she would bang them on the lectern as she was talking, and you would, you weren't falling asleep anyway, but it would rocket you in a certain way. And it was just part of her kind of a persona.
The ring, but also the hand and the way those fingers bend. It's like on the one hand, it looks like slightly anatomically impossible, but it captures exactly how Linda held her hands and her fingers. I mean, there's so much expression in that hand, but also, I mean, you know, Daisy, forgive me, because we're talking about you, you know, as if you, as if you aren't like a woman my age. Daisy's and my birthdays are just a few days apart, so I always remember how old Daisy is. But that sweet and curious and aware look on Daisy's face, and the protective hand, Linda's protective hand around her and everything. I've always thought of this as just one of the great portraits of motherhood and daughterhood. You know, that sort of relationship that you know, and for Linda was extremely generous to her friends, to her students, to people that she, you know, met and fell in like with, and you know, Linda cultivated very deep friendships, but you know, ultimately her family was so important to her. And I think that, you know, the fact that this is one of the really great public images of her in the world, this portrait of her with her daughter, I think is so fitting.
Yeah, it's great. I love the way that Daisy's like about to spring off. I mean, the thing, Neal totally got kids. She totally understood kids, and you see that in all her works.
Yeah.
Let's play a little comparison Wolflinian game. This showed up on my oral exams, my oral exams that I took at the IFA. And of course it was a softball for me, but also something that, you know, was in her masterpiece, Realism, that book. The idea of thinking about realism, not just in terms of one culture. Gustave Courbet's lost now Stonebreakers, Ford Madox Brown's magnificent work, which is in Manchester. My friend Tim Barringer says it's the greatest painting in Manchester. Millet's Autumn Leaves probably is, but there you go. We'll never sort it out. But this idea that I remember her saying to me, and you talk a little bit about in the book, you know, formalism is important, and that when she set out to write her dissertation in the 1950s, she was trying to figure out with Courbet how brushstroke can be political. And I remember her saying, you know, she didn't think she had done it. She didn't think she had proved it, but she had offered a path to trying to understand this period in a new and vital way. And also, you know, to say formalism is not a dirty word. It's not Greenbergian formalism. It's something quite different. She never wanted to get away from the thing and the surface and the form. And, you know, Courbet was a great way to get into it on that. And then the questions that you bring up in the book about the idea of modern art versus modernism, and the question of the modernity of these two paintings. Now, 30 years ago, put this up and people would have laughed at Ford Madox Brown, but I don't think that's the case anymore, because we, due to her work and work of other scholars, opened up the field to thinking about the 19th century in a much more vital and much more interesting way.
And I think that that is that sort of question of the role that formalism must continue to play, right? Or the role, let's call it a formal analysis, must continue to play in art history, is precisely why.
Thank you. That's really what I mean. That's really what I mean.
It's precisely why she was drawn so much to Meyer Shapiro, the art historian Meyer Shapiro, in her career. And she says that she was at the Institute with there were all sorts of interesting people at the Institute studying at NYU at the time. So, Philip Pearlstein was there and Robert Rosenblum was there. And across the park at Columbia, the sort of infamous MoMA curator, Bill Rubin, was studying at Columbia at the time. And she said she got to know Bill Rubin because Bill Rubin was interested in getting the notes from, I think, a class that Krautheimer was teaching or something like that at the Institute. And she wanted to get notes from the class that Meyer Shapiro was teaching at Columbia. So she and Bill Rubin got to be friends so they could trade notes, which I thought was really cute. But there's an essay in the book that's actually a book review of Meyer Shapiro's collection of essays on modernism. And for her, that was a really important publication for her, because it was really, in a way, a declaration of her own manifesto of what she wanted to do. And what she wanted to do was take seriously the need for close formal analysis of what she was looking at, of really close seeing of what she was looking at, with the idea that none of these decisions that artists are making are happening in any sort of vacuum, right? That every, as you said, every brushstroke, and even the idea of the brushstroke was itself, it both had a formal effect, but it was woven into a kind of social and artistic and aesthetic and theoretical kind of landscape, right? And so that you had to understand it in terms of that of that decision, like it was a decision being made among a possibility of decisions, and each one had a meaning. And so, so it was interesting, because the first two essays in the book are really I think all of the essays in the book are really telling of Linda's approach to modernism. But those first two essays, the first one is a piece called 1848, The Revolution in Art History, which was a piece which was a lecture. It was her Frick talk. So, at the IFA and a number of other graduate programs on the East Coast hold a symposium. It's actually organized by the Frick and by the IFA, but they're invited schools. They hold a symposium for graduate students, and graduate students come and give their papers. And, usually each graduate program has a sort of internal competition to decide who will give their paper. And so the first essay is Linda's Frick talk, so done while she was still a graduate student. And, and she very, I think, again, very tellingly, started her talk with a quotation from Karl Marx. At the height of, McCarthyism and Cold War politics, she's sitting there quoting Karl Marx and talking about this materialist reading of mid-19th century art and art theory. And then the second piece is, this review of Meyer Shapiro's book. Again, very much a kind of manifesto. I mean, both pieces are, in a sense, very, they're the shot across the bow. How do you say of saying, okay, yes, I'm in this venerated place where I can only enter if I'm wearing a skirt, and I'm giving this talk, but I'm not going to be doing things the way that they've already been done. And the first one, the 1848 talk, obviously predates her introduction to feminism as a politic or a methodology as well. So, that the leftist politics, the Marxism and the materialist politics, was deeply embedded in her work before she ever got to feminism, and then sort of still part of her work as a feminist.
Yeah, and then the other things to point out, in the book, and it sort of sets out the stage with those early essays, and then includes a number of things that, as I mentioned earlier, have not been printed. A fantastic lecture from 1982 to 1987, she tweaked it a few times, called Sex and the Sepoy Mutiny, the Intersection of Race and Gender in the Colonial Imaginary, in which she talks about a painting which at the time was most obscure, certainly to American audiences, by the great Sir Joseph Noel Paton, In Memoriam from 1858. He was a kind of slightly older artist who adopted elements of pre-Raphaelitism in the 1850s, and he did these great historical paintings. This one, a scene of the so-called Sepoy Mutiny, really the rebellion against the British occupiers of India in the 1850s, with this pyramidal Renaissance structure image of these pasty white British females who are hovering or huddling in a downstairs of a building and trying to avoid the fighting that's going on outside. And then you see in the background Scottish officers who are coming, I think, from the 42nd Highlanders, who are coming in to save them. But interestingly, as she talks about in the essay, originally Paton had the image of Indian soldiers coming in, blood splattered, about to do who knows what to these women, and public disapproval moved him to change it to Scottish rescuers, which further complicates the picture. I won't go into it anymore. You must read it. And then you have one woman of color here, an Indian woman, the Aya, who takes care of the children, who has this feared expression, looking back towards the door. One person looking at the door along with this little girl. And now she's seeing not her own people, but rather the Scots, and is still petrified, right? It's an amazing picture. It's owned by Lord Lloyd Webber, and it's a painting which was engraved and was a huge hit at the time, and a rather obscure thing, but she saw it and turned it into this important essay which no one's been able to read before. She gave me a typescript of it when I was working on it, and now you can read it.
When Linda asked me to start working on the book, she had been working with her assistant at the time, Gabriella Van Auken, putting together her papers for donation to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And so, as they were going through all her papers, Gabriella made this huge accordion file of of papers that could possibly be included in this book. And Linda and I were sitting down going through this accordion file, and I pull out this, typescript from one of the folders, and my jaw fell on the table, because I said, how, I can't think of that she had other Indian graduate students, but I was like, how could you have, you have had me for a student since 1993, how could you have not told me that you wrote this paper that was about India and about the Raj? And and she said, oh yeah, no, I loved doing this. And what was funny is the file had all these, she had given this talk at many places, and lots of professors, all men, which may just reflect the fact that there was too many male faculty members represented in the discipline, or it might suggest something else, had written to her after her talk with these 4 and 5 page long critiques of her paper. And it was so fascinating to me to see, like, what people were objecting to. And of course, Linda was very not defensive, and very pragmatic. You could see that she absorbed the things that she needed to absorb, like, the fair points, but she I think just generally she was also willing, and I think this was really very much part of her survival strategy, given the type of work that she was doing, which was so challenging to many of her colleagues and many of the people in the field, that at least publicly, whatever she worried about in private, publicly, she was very willing to say, like, okay, that critique is coming from, male fragility. She wouldn't have called it that, but that critique is coming from a place that I don't have to listen to it. But it was so, what was interesting is you had one typescript with handwritten notes, and there were 3 or 4 other typescripts with handwritten notes, and actually, like, these hinged pieces where she had typed a new section, and then instead of just printing out the whole thing, she would tape in this hinged piece of paper that was like the new paragraph or whatever, and notes along the side. So it was quite the process of trying to turn it into a kind of single smooth paper. But the gist of the paper was one of the issues in the paper that was so interesting is she was really thinking about that the newspaper stories about this event were extremely graphic and in their description of what could have happened or what almost happened, or to these women, and full of references to like potential sexual violence and all of this kind of stuff. And seemed not to bother anyone, but the visual depiction of these so-called these sepoys coming down the stairs in the original version were considered so incendiary that he was forced to, kind of go back in and repaint that section. And so for her, it really was about this question of like, why do we freak out so much when it comes to visual representation when we don't?
It's true, right? I mean, think about school shootings, right? The press coverage of school shootings, how many bullets were fired, how many people were killed, blah blah blah. But never do you see graphic imagery. And what effect would that have on the public? Yeah. You actually saw, and I don't want to see them, but in a certain point, you have a situation where it's horrific, and the truth needs to be known, and visual culture can do it so well. Otherwise, you get this, which is a kind of heroicizing of a kind and glossing over the true facts, propagandistic in a way, these paintings.
Well, it's also the question, I think, she raises it, and certainly I wonder, in a way, it's really suggestive now, right? She raises the question of there were graphic representations of soldiers dying in fields. There were graphic representations of Indian women and children being, killed and stuff in these various like so-called mutinies or whatever that were happening under a British colonial rule. But here, the fact that it was the white English woman that was at risk made a certain kind of representation off limits. And I think now you can see it as well, where no, you don't see them about school shootings, but certainly we've seen way too many images or videos of Black people being murdered and by police or by non-police in this country, right? And so that the Black body subject to that kind of violence is still accepted, right? And so that that idea of the difference of what body is being subjected to that violence is at the core of Linda's essay on this painting. And I think it's really interesting that she, was sort of thinking about that, thinking about the ways in which white femininity was being protected as a, you know, and questioning in a sense that essay does question the ways that white femininity are being protected in these sorts of representations.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a little quibble that I have.
Okay, good.
One essay that is missing from this volume, I think it's in Mara's. It's in Mara's volume though, right? Is this one, Lost and Found, Once More the Fallen Woman, from Art Bulletin of March 1978, which is one of the reasons why I got interested in Pre-Raphaelite art, because it's a magnificent discussion of not just Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Found, which is in Delaware, unfinished painting, but of portrayals in literature, deep dive into literature, and in visual culture of prostitution in London, in England. And, you know, it showed me that she was really interested in this stuff at one point, but it made her receptive to the kind of things I was going to then, you know, try to do in my work. And I at a personal level, I kind of wish it was in there. I understand maybe why it didn't fit. It's published elsewhere. But at the same time, when I was looking through the index, you know, there's no mention of Pre-Raphaelitism. There's no mention of Rossetti. There's no mention, there's a little bit on William Morris, but it's more about the politics. There's no mention of Turner, the greatest artist of the first half of the 19th century. And, you know, it's a little bit of a gap. And I started thinking about why there's no mention of Turner. And maybe she never wrote about Turner. Maybe it's just the kind of antipathy to landscape. She wasn't that interested in pure landscape painting.
She wasn't that interested in pure landscape painting, but what I'll tell you is that this, so you know, there's a couple of things here. Like one is that this volume was sort of came out of two places. One was that it really has to be considered a companion volume to the other volume that Linda did, which is like, you know, it's cream background and red lettering on the cover. They look like they're related. They look like they're cousins, but it's her writings on women artists.
Maybe Raven, you could put that in the chat if you don't mind. Mara Riley's collected essays on women, or what's the title, Aruna?
I think it's just called Women Artists. Is the full title, but bye, Maria. So there was just a message.
Yeah, Women Artists.
It's called Women Artists, and so, you know, but one of the real purposes of this volume was that I mean, when Linda and I talked, I think there was a sense on Linda's part, and certainly there was a sense on my part, that Linda's career was being, in a sense, reduced to why have there been great women artists and writings about women artists. Now, obviously, those two things are huge, but in a sense, they're inseparable from this other, you know, part of what she was doing, which was really transforming the understanding of modernism itself. And so that there was, in a sense, there was you know, people, you know, understand how important Linda is, but there was a reduction, in a sense, of her importance to just this one aspect, and not enough of a clarity or a vision of how much she did that was still feminist, still informed by feminist principles often, but that was really going after the idea of what and how modernity works, what modernity was and how modernity works, and then how that all feeds into modernism as the kind of aesthetic form of modernity at any one moment. And so so that's how the book came about, was really sort of recentering Linda's writings on modernity as such. So and in doing so, obviously, you know, one of the things that was clear is that there were way more things than we could put in a book. And the biggest part of the editorial process was actually this consistent, like going back to the press and saying like, okay, is this short enough? Is this short enough? Is this short enough? And eventually having to make some painful cuts. And what I'll tell you is that this particular essay made it to the second to last round. So Jason, I want you to know that it wasn't that, I don't know if that makes it better or worse.
Just like England in soccer.
I know, I'm not sure.
Always the runner-up.
I'm not sure if it makes it better or worse, but it was it was certainly on, this was certainly an essay that was really important for Linda to have in. Now, part of the calculation, a lot of the essays that didn't make it in, I think almost all of the essays that didn't make it in except for one were part of her previous collection. So I think this one,
they're already published.
Republished. So we sort of prioritized the things that hadn't been published, and there was only one unpublished piece that in the end didn't make it in, and that was for different reasons. And that was a piece on the body as art object. And it was a really interesting piece that Linda did in the 80s, again, a lecture that had never been published as an essay, that was about, that was really an attempt, I think, by Linda to, at a point when there was that African art histories were still very marginalized in the field and sort of devalued, I think, by the sort of, mainstream art history, that it was an attempt to draw into alignment modernist practices of modernist avant-garde practices like costuming and fashion and modes of self-adornment with various African, also 19th and 20th century things like masks and costuming and tattooing and piercing and all of those things. So it was a really interesting piece, because she was really trying to say that if we're going to look at what Sophie Taber Arp was doing as art, then we also have to look at what these early 20th century African costume makers, West African costume makers were doing as art as well. But it was written in the 80s. It was written by a non-specialist, as Linda would be the first to sort of say. And there was a way in which it would have been a lot to ask of contemporary readers to read past certain choices of language and things like that, certain modes of interpretation, to sort of see that what she was doing was kind of, I think fairly progressive for the time. I think it would have been hard to translate that into 21st century language.
Certainly more advanced than MoMA's primitivism show, it would seem to me. I mean, she first did that essay you're talking about, Self as Art Object, in 1974. Right. So, but I understand the reason. These are decisions you have to make. It's the right one.
Yeah, and I think that it was, and I think it was absolutely in response to, obviously not the MoMA primitivism show, but the thinking that led to MoMA's primitivism show. Very much in response to that. So that was a tough one, because that was like, that was an essay that was really interesting historically. But like, the other thing for Linda is that Linda very rarely modified her essays for when they were republished. She had an idea that this was part of the historical record, and so I'm going to keep them as is. That wasn't necessarily always possible here, just because
Mm.
because they were lectures, and there was a some modification, obviously, when you go from a lecture to the written page, because how much
Right.
might have been conveyed by Linda's hand gesture right in the
Yeah.
room, that somehow
Yeah.
has to be introduced in the space,
That's right.
in
That's
words.
right.
But in general, we sort of kept largely to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say also, I mentioned it before, that the index is invaluable in this volume in a period when, frankly, in publishing, indexes are often left off,
Yeah.
especially in museum catalogs. And it's frustrating as hell, frankly,
Yeah.
because you can't find anything. And the
Yeah.
index is a labor of love, because I know how long that takes to do. I did my own books. But also you will find that she wrote something on Robert Colescott, who has a great show at the New Museum right now. And it's brilliant, the paragraph that she wrote, So that's one of the joys of this, that you can bop around and see her little snippets that she wrote about this and that and certain artists. We also wanted to bring in the fact that I know we have a real brilliant poet coming up. I have a couple more images and then we'll turn over to questions. But that Linda was also a poet. And of course, she was published in the Rail. I think that maybe the first time her poetry was published in the May 2017 issue of the Brooklyn Rail. I got a message from Anselm Berrigan, our treasured editor of poetry since the late 2000s, about how these worked their way in there. It involved Marianne Cause, and her poems had never been published. And she sent some scans of like 8 or 9 poems to Anselm in a couple of batches, and he chose 5 to print, including one that he printed planked in the museum from 1944, when Linda was like 12. That was typewritten in an ancient typewriter. But I thought I'd pick one to share with you today, because she was a very beautiful poet. And you can look at the Carpaccio image, and I'll read you the poem. It's called Carpaccio's Birth of the Virgin for H.M. 2 rabbits nibbling lettuce on the floor have stopped the rush of masculine perspective. Lying in bed beneath her canopy, Anna is calmly self-absorbed, reflective. She alone is thought. All around her world of women welcomes the new girl with tasks of homely job, and tasks abound. One turns a spindle in a distant room. Another warms the diaper at her fire. A turbaned matron occupies herself with swaddling tape. All hands conspire in the timeless ceremonial of the womb. The old nurse shifts her weight to feel the bath, the baby virgin sheltered in her arm. Only old impotent Joseph on his stick is left to represent the masculine rants. He's clearly on the way. Cleanliness, charm, and order mark this space as holy, with the unself-conscious grace of ordinary caring. On the wall, above the shelf with candle, bowls and fruit, a Hebrew tablet, sign of the arcane, warns of future glory, future doom. Meanwhile, a modest servant, robed in red, cools down the mother's porridge with her spoon. Accademia Carrara, Bergamo, June 18, 1999. What a wonderful poem. And, the person that I think of when I look at works by Carpaccio is John Ruskin, who wrote beautifully about Carpaccio and then a little manically towards the end of his life. But of course, he had not had 2 children, and he knew nothing about family, childbirth, or the home in any sense, right? And you can imagine her being stopped in her tracks by this picture, maybe not for the first time, in the summer of 1999, and having to write about it, in this case, a poem.
I think, I believe summer of 99 was when she was actually at Bellagio, where she was in residence, and there were a number of writers there that she really connected with, and poets, in fact. But I think, one of the things, just listening to you read the poem and looking at the imagery and looking at the painting, this is the lesson that I think I've learned from Linda without really being conscious of it, is the way that description can be so many things at once, right? It can be description, it can be just telling you what's there. It can be argument, right? Pointing you to a particular reading of what's there. And it can be poetry at one time, right? And this is such a beautiful instance of that. And I think, you know, the poem that appears in the Rail, the actual typescript of the poem from 1944, you know, she wrote that when she was really a child, but she quotes it in one of the essays in the book. She goes back to it, and I think that it's. And
let me give the title for a second. Yeah. It's one of my favorite essays. It's called "Museum as Bildungsroman: My Life in Art, Trash, and Fashion" from 2002, and she quotes her 1944 self. It's magic.
It's fantastic, but I think that, like, you know, I think that those things, right, the intersection of poetry and of the visual and of writing, right, really is a thread throughout her career. And I think G.E. Schwartz asked a question of how did she come to Baudelaire, and I think that was very much she came to Baudelaire through that intersection. She came to Baudelaire as a student of French literature, you know, and an instructor of French literature at Vassar before she even started her PhD at the Institute. So, you know, but yeah.
2 more slides and that's it. And just to say that Philip and Linda gave us a subsequent gift in 2010, which is this much more arch portrait from which was donated to the Brooklyn Museum by the family. There's something of painting. I was trying to figure out what she's reading here, but that wonderful sort of knowing glance, and of course 2 rings in this one, double up in this picture in Philip's mid style or mid-late style here, which is quite different from his earlier work.
You know, the family also donated the original Pearlstein painting, the 68 painting, to the Sapphire Center. So yeah,
that's right. So let's end here and we'll turn it open to questions. I just thought I'd show you her last post from July 29, 2017. Perfect, right? This really old image of her with friends, who knows where, many years ago. And then here she is on the right. So thank you so much, Aruna. Getting a little emotional for today and for the gift of this book. We're going to open it up to questions and we'll come in and out as we go. I'm sure a lot of you are eager to ask some questions or reminiscences, what have you. You know, what did she do for you? I mean, she did so much for us that almost like you remember all the times that you spent with her. I remember the last show I went with her to was the Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the spring of 2016. And the most interesting thing, the thing that she wanted to see most of all was the men's legs. She's like, we have to check out all the men's legs because she is a great painter of men's legs, right? This artist, Vigée-Lebrun, whose politics were more than questionable, but she could do men's legs like nobody's business. That was the thing that she most delighted in. So let me stop the share and Raven, take it away. DJ us through the questions, please. And thank you so much, Aruna, for this today. It's been great.
Oh, it's been great fun to reconnect with you as well, Jason.
Thank you guys for that wonderful conversation. You guys have done such a great job at even me and my colleagues were having our own questions, and you guys done such a great job of answering them during your conversation already. We do have a final question from Fong. So whenever you're ready, Fong.
Thank you, Raven. Thank you, Aruna. Jason, what a delightful conversation. It's brilliant. You know, I was deciding whether I was going to go to Columbia for graduate school, not history, which I never went for because of a letter that my superior wrote saying that you have a good mind, but you possess no monastic temperament.
Oh.
Therefore, the likelihood becoming art historian is very impoverished. But I just want to, one quick question is that I bought this annual, Tom Hess used to do this in the 50s until the 60s. Occasionally, he would invite other people to participate. And on this instance, he did it with John Ashbery, also who was on our advisory board, the great poet. And I bought this in second year in college. And in it, it begins with Linda Gray essay, the invention of the Avant-Garde, 1832, 1880. I think it was published 1968. And it was very important to me because leading to her scholarship of Courbet, obviously, she dealt deeply and believed to the day she, the very day, the end days. I remember seeing her before maybe 2012 with Kirsten. And she still argued for avant-garde as an idea. She basically think that we're going through phases now where all of that value is not being appreciated, it's not being permeated or cultivated and whatnot. But I remember that in that article, she began talking deeply about Sergio Torres. You guys remember? Who was a great art critic who championed Courbet and Midier. But he's also the one who discovered Vermeer, brought Vermeer back to incredible relevance, neglected 200-something years. But in the article, she talked also about Saint-Simon, who coined the term avant-garde. So I want to ask you, Aruna, and you, Jason, whether that subject been brought up when you guys were studying with her at the Institute.
You know, what's interesting, Fong, is that that was another, that essay, Invention of the Avant-Garde, was another essay that she and I had a sort of disagreement about putting in the book, because to me that was a very important essay in terms of my own formation, because it got me, at that point, everybody was talking about the avant-garde and, you know, and claiming very different things for it in a sense. And so that was a really important essay for me. And I'm just looking at I literally have to look at the table of contents because it changed so much that one actually didn't even make it in, I think, because there was so much else to do. But Linda was a person, when everyone started talking about X, Linda would say, okay, but what about Y, right? Like, and so I feel like at the point that I started grad school, and you know, I was 1 year behind Jason in terms of grad school. To the point that, you know, she started teaching at the Institute, you know, there was a whole group of scholars, you know, mostly organized around the October magazine, but not exclusively, like, you know, that were really laying claims to what the avant-garde was and who was inheriting the mantle of the avant-garde. And so in my memory, I think Linda was actually moving away from that formation, moving away from thinking about avant-garde versus not avant-garde, and thinking more about modernity, right? And modernism, and, you know, and modernity in a way that was really about this Baudelairean formulation of being of the moment, right? And asking the question, right? If this was made now, how is it modern? That's how I remember it. I don't know, Jason, do you have a different memory of it?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I avoided the October Mafia like the plague because they all came to speak at the IFA. Some of them showed up hungover. I won't name any names, and gave random talks about vortices. Yeah. Just the initials are HF. But you know, the idea of the avant-garde was something that in their minds was already cemented. But when Tim Barringer and Allison Smith and I did our big pre-athlete show at Tate in 2012, I was more thinking about what Linda was onto, which is what you're saying. And we were talking about the avant-garde in a different kind of defined sense, which was, you know, are you going to bring change to culture? How do you do that? How do the pre-athletes do it? You know, the thing that always interested me about British art, which was always thought of as quite stodgy, was that unlike in France, where the Impressionists, they couldn't get a gig, right? They couldn't show their works. Only Manet, because he kind of played the game, but he tweaked it and he used parody. But the rest of them were not really visible. But in Britain, you know, the Royal Academy was open-minded enough to exhibit all of these artists who were deeply radical. And the results were immediate in art and then in culture. And if that's not the definition of the avant-garde, I don't know what is. You know, it filtered down everywhere into taste. And of course, they were as reflective of empire and critical of social mores and ideas about race and class, especially, et cetera. You know, the way that she was thinking about it was truly an inspiration to me, and not as sort of, you know, so seeing things with blinders on, which always drove me crazy. And, you know, the end product is you go to the Met today, Metropolitan Museum of Art today, you walk through the 19th century galleries, and thanks to a lot of younger curators, including Alison Hokinson, one of Linda's students, you see a lot of art in those galleries that would never have gotten through the door under previous administrations. And that opening up of the field, new tendrils, new directions of the modern, whether it's in Scandinavia or in Italy or in America, are poking through in a vivid way, and makes it so much more interesting to teach the period, frankly. I mean, that's just on a basic level. And the best thing, and I've said this before, and then I'll stop, is that you look at students today, you introduce them to the artists who in the past were the kind of monumental figures of modernism in the past, and you introduce them to people like Hammershøi and John Everett Millay and Runge, you know, or symbolist artists, and they are keen on all of it. They are interested in all of it. And that's, you know, the point really where we want to be. And then we think about the effect on the culture. And I don't think it's changed today. I mean, the effect on the culture, isn't that the goal, Fong? Isn't that what the artists are after?
It's absolutely to the point, because after all, Baudelaire, just for the record, Jason, Aruna.
Yeah.
Jason wrote a negative review of Delacroix. Would you believe it? That I still get a lot of ranting opinion against dissenting views on that matter, but it was Baudelaire's favorite artist, because the internal past is very much on the present. And of course, Linda's favorite book is Baudelaire's Paris Spleen.
Yeah.
Just in case you both don't know. I'm sure you do know. But to be continued. Thank you, you guys.
I mean, you know, it's really interesting. You know, Linda, her career, a lot of it is about writing about artists that I think she had questions about. Obviously, Degas, we know, in his anti-Semitism, Renoir and his aesthetics, you know, and his treatment of the female body in later career. But that's, you know, that was part of her program, and you know, she was in some ways a product of her time and what was available in museums. And she was adventurous to the extent that she could be. I think Rosenblum was the same way, although he would have said, you know, I love bad art. He would have said that straight out. But you know, you have to be, I don't know, you have to be open-minded. That's the key thing, right? You must be open-minded.
Well,
you're never going to get anywhere.
there was a way in which, I mean, like, Rosenblum and Linda, Robert Rosenblum and Linda were both such characters in their own ways. And I think that Rosenblum was so interesting because he very much, they were both contrarians in a certain sense, right? Like they'd both gone to like this graduate school that was, in a way like the center of like traditional art history and the kind of weight of art history, and especially a particularly German informed art historical tradition. But they both came out with a kind of contrarian kind of approach. And so Linda always used to joke that for her, more was more, right? Like, and she used to joke about this in the early 90s, right? When minimalism had sort of come back with a vengeance, right? In the contemporary art scene, right? And so she sees all these people who are embracing, there was that moment everyone was talking about the 60s coming back in the 90s, right? Like the 60-90 moment. And, Linda was like, forget it. I want maximalism, right? Like I want this, over the top thing. Like some of her reviews, what was so remarkable about it is that she was deliberately being the singular voice of that was going to disagree with the mainstream. And so, the two reviews that both of which are in the book that really come to mind for me are the review of Thelma Golden's Blackmail show at the Whitney Museum from '94, which the mainstream press, or the predominantly white press, that they lambasted that show, or they didn't understand it, or they didn't take it seriously, or they wrote it off as mere identity, the sort of scourge of identity politics. And Linda actually turned it into an object lesson, right, for her audience of white art historians, right? And so, she said, okay, I went to see this show, and then I went to the big Poussin retrospective in Paris. And guess what? I read those Poussins entirely differently because I had been thinking about the ideas from the Blackmail show, right? Like that was her saying, like, this is why you need to look at this work, right? Like, the reason that you need to look at this work is so that you'll look at the rest of the world differently, and that you'll look at other art differently. And then the other one was the review of—
Let me just add about the Blackmail review, which is brilliant, is that she did two things that almost no one else did. One is she read the catalog, and she read Thelma Golden's introduction very carefully. And the second thing she did is she looked at the work.
She looked at the work.
Said, yeah, she did. And she's like, wow, Lorna Simpson is great. Correct, right? David Hammond is really interesting and great. Correct, right? She was interested always in the aesthetics. If it didn't grip her aesthetically, she wasn't going to write about it, and clearly it gripped her enough aesthetically to say, I'm going to champion this important attempt.
And also, I'm not going to let anyone beat up on this, on this show or curator or these artists, right? Because they're actually, if you just get your head out of your ass, they're actually saying something that you need to hear, right? And so that's one of them. And then the other one is the review of a double review of the Matisse retrospective and the fantastic Great Utopia show that was at the Guggenheim. That was, really for a lot of us, our first real view into Russian constructivism in all of its manifestations, right? Like the, in design, in textiles, in art, in photography, in industrial design, everything. And, and Linda made this fascinating argument. First of all, she said, okay, first floor of Matisse is great. Second floor, the less said, the better, right? Like, I mean, just the ability, at the same time that everyone is like fainting in, awe over the Matisse show, her ability to say like, okay, second floor of the Matisse show, who cares? But then being able to say like, okay, the reason that people are so crazy over the Matisse show is because it represents a kind of contemporary cultural conservatism, or it feeds into a contemporary cultural conservatism, a bonfire of the vanities kind of moment in the New York cultural scene that is precisely counteracted by what's going on in the Great Utopia show, which is actually, like, you know, sort of, you know, a real demonstration of this moment of possibility of the Soviet Union, you know, in this sort of, you know, this early moment in which it seemed to open up all sorts of possibilities for emancipation, right, on very many different levels. And so I think,
and where the women were artists and not odalisques.
And not odalisques, right? And so there was, you know, there was a way in which, you know, that very much came out of, you know, Linda, you know, if everyone was going left, she was going to be the one saying, like, you know, okay, but what's going on over here on the right, you know, or, you know, not politically, but, you know, just directionally. And so, you know, I think that, and I think that there was, you know, I think that she was always suspicious of the orthodoxy. She was always suspicious of, if people were agreeing too much on something, then she wanted to know, like, why, right? Like, why, you know, she didn't like that idea that there would be a kind of unanimity without interrogating the reasons why there was that unanimity of opinion. And so I think that really drove a lot of her thinking and her scholarship in ways that were, I mean, so productive, right?
And also Fang and everybody, you know, I mean, the role of the critic for her, there was no difference from the role of the art historian in a way, or even the way she approached her writing.
Yeah.
As a critic and art historian. And I'd say I think the same way. I mean, if you, not to plug myself, but if you look at the review I did of the David show and the Charles Ray show, which is simultaneously at the Met, the joint review, I don't think of that. I think of it as art history, really, and an accessible review.
Those two reviews I got praise from.
The Delacroix review was, yeah, the Delacroix review we'll sort of keep aside for the moment, but at least those two, Jason, those two you got some good.
There you go. But I think that's an important thing to point out about her writing, that she didn't see any difference.
That, you know, we'll go give the poet the microphone in a minute.
Yeah.
But basically, that was the framework, the structure that Tom had devised for the reviewers of the golden moment of art news, you know, the 50s, 60s, was that he invited artists who can write, like Fairfield Porter, Braxton Downs, and others, and he invited people like Linda, Maya Shapiro, Irving Sandler, who can write criticism, as much as poets like John Ashbery, like Jimmy Schuyler, you know, and others, of course, Frank O'Hara in the mix. So that's exactly what I learned. I mean, that for the Rail, our art section comprises similar review by different people from different disciplines. So anyway, I mean, we're gonna have part 2 some point because it's important talk. Thank you, Luna. Thank you, Jason. Back to you, Raven.
Thank you guys so much for such a great conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet, Chelsea Harlan, to the stage. The poet Chelsea Harlan is from Appalachian, Virginia. She holds a BA from Bennington College, as well as an MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College, where she was a Truman Capote Fellow, and where she has enjoyed teaching English and creative writing. She is the author of chapbooks Country Music from Two Plum Press and Mummy from Montez Press, written in collaboration with London-based painter Daisy Pears. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you all so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Raven. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Carolyn, and everybody at Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to read. And obviously, thank you, Jason and Aruna. I could listen to you guys talk all day long.
You kind of did, Chelsea. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if he's here, but I should thank Anselm, who I had the pleasure of studying with in my MFA at Brooklyn College. I should say too that visual art is sort of always on my mind as a poet, and I'm always joking that poetry, or my poems anyway, always wish they were paintings. And I wonder what Linda would have to say about that. I also just loved so much, and thank you for reading, Jason, that one poem of Linda's. I'm so struck by how certain poets will organize visual images. And I love that she could get away with having a word like diaper in the middle of a poem, you know, and structuring that image of the painting as she did. So I'm going to read a poem. I also noticed she had a slant rhyme with the word doom, only to end on the word spoon. Yeah. So funny in a way. And so I have a poem with the word doom in it, and I'll read that first. And then I just have a couple of short ones. These are from this new book I have coming out called Bright Shade. Okay, so this first poem is called In the Rear View. Lloyd's hogs dissolved in pale gravel scud. Mountains rumpled and shrank like wool. Impossible horseflies zagged with conspiracy, and we agreed, forget it. Heaviness was felt now and then occasionally nothing but the warm wishes of our would-be sex cult toward another open year. The little edges of the hills like verdigris knives. The looping partition built to oblige the trees rhythmically shifted below us, silently tectonic, and the stained glass mural situation was anything but mundane. The tesserae, all fractured reflection, it was like they knew. We all knew and felt better to know we all knew about the doom, doomed as it was, as we all were. It was our doom, and that was all we had. And in having that, we had mad gladness, as well as other gladnesses sometimes too. And I was trying hard to wag my tail in time to the warm drone of slow big band coming nice and orangely at me like prayer from another room. And as long as I'm thinking of the color orange, I think Aruna, you had said description can be so many things at once in regards to Linda's writing, and I love that idea. And yeah, it's sort of a concern of mine in poetry. So this is called This Is Also That. The sun is a pumpkin. The pumpkin is a small sun. The pumpkin is a small hard sun. The pumpkin is fun. Orange is fun, and the hard orange sun is a small fun orange pumpkin. The orange pumpkin is in the fall. The fall of the orange sun is small. The hard orange fall is fun, and the orange is in the feather. The sun is the hard orange feather. The fun feather is the small spirit. The orange spirit is the twist, and the twist is the small fun fall. The twist is the dance. Okay, so I just have another one and then a really tiny one. This one's called Another Sunday Poem. Cancel rent. We're out at the sunset again, above the tubs, below big birds, cliff types hugging, cypresses like creepy green gloves, creepy in a beautiful way. You said a canyon is an inverted mountain. I was thinking, God, you're smart. When I pass back the spliff on the park bench, I just don't want any children to see me setting bad examples everywhere I go. We're trying to spell the woman's name who lives in the valley with one long gray braid. We need a place with a yard. We need to show our friends the same hospitality they have shown us for millennia, a language that adequately confronts the flaws that keep us from becoming the country we could be. In other words, the truth is, truth cannot be conflated with beauty when beauty is an empty idea, like a JPEG of a painting. Land's End is full of people today. little blankets, plates of food, couples kissing behind jagged rocks, couples kissing on the edge of history, taking subtly different pictures of the same regular phenomenon, the sun setting. How is it this happens all the time? Yeah, thank you guys again for having me. This one's really short, I promise. Thank you for the conversation. It's called Leaving the House. Leaving the house, like salad, usually requires dressing. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was
Fantastic.
a beautiful reading. And thank you, Aruna and Jason, for the wonderful conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rail's YouTube channel. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow for a poetry reading at 1 p.m. curated by Vit Bakatis. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as we leave. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you, Raven.
Thanks, Jason.
Appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
so
you, Chelsea, coming to you live from Monticello, New York. Upstate.
I fully intend on getting a copy of that book for the library where I work, by the way.
Oh, Linda's, yeah, this.
Thank you.
It's like a gift. It's like a gift from beyond because of all the stuff you've never seen in it. It's amazing.
Thank you so much, Chelsea and Jason and Aruna. That was incredible.
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
so
everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Chloe.
Thank you,
Thank
Jason.
you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Hey, Cal, how are you?
Yeah, it's good to see you, Jason.
Hold on.
Thank
hold on,
you.
hold
So,
on.
so amazing.
Hold on. Chelsea's and I just wanted to, so I tuned in. My name is Abigail. And I love her so much. Figure out the Zoom call.
Thank you, Abigail.
All of
Yeah.
took notes, all the stuff today, and I sometimes say that she got all from me, but she's an incredible. I'm not gonna cry, but she just it's so inspiring. So but everybody on it was just a really good experience to listen to all of y'all today.
Thank you.
So thank
Thank you.
Whoa.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Orange is the new
everyone.
orange.
Thank you,
Chelsea.
Jason.
Cheers.
Right.
Orange is the new orange.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.